to the first module in our anti-racism series. Module 1, The Roots of White Supremacy, explores the history of race and racism in North America and how white supremacist thinking continues to be sustained in teaching and learning. We are your hosts for Module 1. My name is Emma Lind, and I'm a professor of gender, sexualities, and women's studies at Okanagan College. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a white cisgendered woman living as an uninvited visitor in the unceded Silk Territory in what is also referred to as Kelowna, British Columbia.
And I am Marlon Evans Sinclair, a school leader currently working within the Independent School Network. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm a Black British cis-queer man from Jamaican parents. I reside in Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples.
In this module, we define what we mean when we say white. We also identify the minoritization of French language teaching as part of a British colonial tradition, and we discuss how white anglo-saxon Protestant norms show up in curriculum and teaching. I was raised in Saskatchewan in the 1980s and 1990s, at the height of Quebecois nationalism. I was educated in French immersion schools, and I worked summer jobs as a bilingual tour guide in national museums and historic sites. These summer jobs, along with the French immersion programs, are examples of federal government programs designed to build national unity as a response to Quebecois nationalism and calls for separatism. Participating in national unity programs gave me numerous opportunities to learn deeply about anti-French discrimination in Canada. For a lot of my early adulthood, my bilingualism and commitment to French education was part of what I saw as a commitment to do better as an Anglophone. You could even say it was the beginning of me being consciously anti-racist. I was encouraged to think seriously about power and equity and the importance of preserving one's language as a matter of personal integrity. I considered the overrepresentation of English services, language, and media in Quebec to reflect British imperialism, and I was offended by how often Francophones were encouraged to become bilingual, while Anglophones navigated the world never learning anyone else's language. It's not that my mind has changed about those issues, but I now look back on that period of my life and I can see that the story of Canada that was promoted in my French immersion classrooms and the story I was telling as a tour guide during my high school summers was a story that kept forgetting to say anything about colonialism, Indigenous people, or immigrants. So there's this odd prevailing assumption that Francophones were always, or only, white. For me, anti-racist education has been a process of looking beneath the surface, of studying the backstory, so that I can more effectively identify where silences are being kept. Anti-racism as a practice for me means becoming trained to recognize the patterns of exclusion, especially in taken for granted official histories, narratives, and status quo ways of teaching.
Thinking about the approach for this module and the wider course, I'd like to use this visual, which I'll talk through and explain. Imagine a line of progress where the belief that non-racist or oppressive actions lead to a neutral outcome. If nothing further is added to tip the balance of things, then many believe that their individual non-contribution is in support of a wider neutralizing of bad things. However, an oversight with this thinking is that it doesn't take into account that historic actions by people that at best had the same thought patterns and at worst intentionally sought out to tip the scales means that we are already lopsided and we are not neutral, not in our thoughts or our actions. The stage has already been set for oppression to occur. So what does this mean for the level of intentional action needed? Well, in order to rectify what we have inherited and to take ourselves and those who come after us on a more just course, we need to work to counter the passive inaction of non-oppression and the direct actions of oppression. Using this image, I'd say that we shouldn't get fooled into thinking that we're at the point where we can start to reduce our efforts to bend back to the line of neutrality. We are very much down by the bulge that is asking us to go further than we often think is necessary to do so. What we're working to do is to reverse and upend centuries-old and very embedded ideologies and practices. This module is designed to further show you what that means.
Before we begin, we'd like to invite you to reflect on your own experience of French language education and anti-racism. Consider the following questions as invitations to place your own experience within a larger context of anti-racism within French as a second language teaching. We invite you to reach out to your colleagues and discuss these together.
We begin by framing our module in the context of activist ideas. This quotation from Jamaican activist and politician Marcus Garvey highlights the role education plays in sustaining powerful movements and communities. He wrote that a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and their culture is like a tree without roots. This module, The Roots of White Supremacy, would explore how racism is a multi-layered system of power. Only some of its qualities can be seen above the surface.
There are many frameworks that exist for studying racism. Here are two. The covert-overt racism pyramid can be thought of like an iceberg. At the top are examples of overt forms of racism, examples it's reasonable to say any of us would agree are racist. Slurs, stereotypes, hate crimes. We are living in an era where there is a general consensus that these things are bad. These things appear above the metaphorical waterline. However, rarely do we talk about the smaller covert events, the phrases, silences, and social patterns that are also racist, and in fact prop up what is visible above the surface. For instance, it could be that a racist slur is generally understood to be harmful. But what about quietly choosing not to intervene when you hear a racist joke? Or forgiving someone's racist behavior because they are otherwise kind, or insecure, or possibly related to you? Anti-racist education is about teaching people how to make connections, to see how racism works as an integrated system, rather than a series of individual events.
The four-dimension structure of racism accomplishes a similar goal, breaking down racism into institutional, structural, internalized, and interpersonal dimensions. This again reinforces the idea that racism is simply not just what we see happening on our personal lives alone. It relies on government policy, hiring practices, and relationships, as well as our own internal thoughts and feelings. Racism is all-encompassing. This can be a bewildering idea to tackle. So let's begin with the history of race itself.
When we're talking about the idea of race, we're not just talking about discrimination or hate. We're talking about a particular way of thinking that imagines all of humanity being organized into a hierarchy, with some people being considered more civilized or advanced than others. And that's just simply not true. There is only one human race. So, in order to understand race and racism, we need to understand where this idea came from. And that's why, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to be referring to race as a figment of the European imagination. Hear me out. Every culture on Earth has had power structures within themselves. Every culture on Earth has enacted discrimination upon others, be they insiders or outsiders. There have been invasions, injustice, dehumanization, and conflict over resources everywhere. But that hasn't always been racism. Sometimes it's been interreligious conflict or class conflicts. Sometimes there has been short-term political persecution that ends within a generation, or persecution related to illness that ends when the sick person is no longer sick. The idea that persecution could exist based on race, an immovable, unchangeable, mythical characteristic located within our bodies, that was a particularly terrible idea that emerged in a particular time and place in European society. The tricky thing is, it didn't emerge all at once. Race has been strengthened by a series of revolutions in European life that took place over hundreds of years. In very broad terms, we're speaking from about the 1600s to the 1900s as a period of time when virtually every aspect and sector of European society changed dramatically. For instance, with the scientific revolution, as well as the Protestant Reformation, the intellectual authority of the church diminished in European society. Democratizing revolutions curtailed the inherited power of kings and queens. Industrial production displaced agrarian economies. At the same time, throughout these centuries, many countries in Europe were engaged in imperialism and colonialism. Put simply, colonialism involves controlling someone else's territory from afar. By the end of the 19th century, European powers controlled 85% of the Earth's surface. Britain had the largest empire at that time. For European countries practicing colonialism, every aspect of their society was engaged in the project. When countries would send ships of soldiers or administrators to colonial territories, scientists, missionaries, merchants, anthropologists, and artists would join them. Colonial travel was one way that every field of research, business, and the arts incorporated a colonial mindset within their respective sectors. Colonialism was becoming the lens through which Europeans saw the rest of the world. This was happening at the same time that democratic ideals like freedom and liberty for all were being embraced. It's not entirely surprising. At the same time that European powers were participating in the takeover of other people's lands and participating in the transatlantic slave trade, the idea of race shows up to justify practices that were inherently inhuman and undemocratic. Race was a way that Europeans could justify the violence of colonialism because the notion of race suggested not everybody was created equal. Some were thought not to be civilized enough to govern themselves, and others were considered to be so civilized they had a responsibility to govern others. This is the idea at the heart of race. As I mentioned earlier, Europeans did not invent the idea of colonialism. Europeans took part in colonialism at a time when industrialized production enabled them to intensify their invasions on a scale never before seen. That is the reason that European colonialism reached such global proportions when it did. The history we're discussing is a history that spans centuries. So, one of the key features I'd like to emphasize is that racism is always reinventing itself. Stereotypes, myths, and even racial categories have changed many times over the last few hundred years. One question to keep in the back of your mind when evaluating any racial stereotype is, how does this image or idea reinforce power, and in whose interests? One example of racism shapeshifting can be seen in the stereotypes about Indigenous people in North America. As we'll discuss later, Canada was not always a settler colony. The British and French originally came to these territories to participate in the fur trade. For a 200 to 300 year period, the British sent primarily young, single, unskilled men to North American territories. Like in Europe, trade in North America happened frequently through kinship systems. British authorities encouraged young white men to join Indigenous families for their own survival. In his best-selling book, A Fair Country, John Ralston Saul argues that these young men married up when they married Indigenous women. Marrying into an Indigenous family meant kinship, it meant financial security, it meant access to trading routes, it meant access to survival during the harsh northern winters. And yet, looking at this image from Disney's film Pocahontas, we see the white trader represented as a kind of Prince Charming. Pocahontas is sexualized as a young princess, and the plot of the film involves John Smith saving Pocahontas from her domineering, less civilized father. Stereotypes about Indigenous women as princesses dominated during an era of the fur trade where European men were encouraged to join Indigenous families. 100 years later, at a different stage of colonialism, colonial officials worried that European men would become less civilized if they continued to live in Indigenous family systems. European women were strategically brought over to North America in order to so-called civilize the white men and re-establish British families. During this era, the racist stereotypes shifted, and Indigenous women started being portrayed as lazy, alcoholic, and unfit to mother, in contrast to the proper, civilized British women. These racist stereotypes persist, and we have seen the harm that they've caused in contributing to colonial policies that disrupt Indigenous families, such as residential schools, forced sterilization, and the 60s scoop. The example I just used talked about the relationship between racism and colonialism. I mentioned that colonial policy has shifted over several hundred years in North America, and racist stereotypes have also shifted. Canada is what's called a settler colony. Settler colonies are different from other types of colonies because the purpose of a settler colony is to create a new society based upon Indigenous erasure. Other types of colonies may focus only on extracting a resource, like sugarcane or bananas. In these colonies, colonial officials may live out a portion of their career and then return to the colonizing country. There may be an upper class that permanently moves to the colonial territory, but generally it's the Indigenous or an otherwise indentured population that extracts the resource. Caribbean countries like Jamaica can be considered resource extraction colonies. Another type of colony would be a military enclave of sorts, where a foreign power establishes a military base, and again, a class of colonial officials may work there for a period of time, but not live there permanently. The American occupation of Iraq would be this kind of colony. Canada is a settler colony. In a settler colony, settlers come to stay with the expectation that they have arrived in their country. The national myths a settler colony tells about itself constantly justify or reinforce colonial occupation and try to make it look natural or normal. Consider language like the so-called Fathers of Confederation, or the fact every Canadian city has a Queen Street, a King Street, and a Victoria Street. Indigenous history in Canadian textbooks often begins 10,000 years ago and ends abruptly in 1867. Settler history is considered to be the most important, validated, and relevant history in Canadian classrooms. These are patterns that continue to elevate and celebrate the accomplishments of white historical figures by marginalizing and silencing non-white communities. Understanding settler colonialism is key to understanding white supremacist racism in Canada. When I say that Canada is a settler colony, it's important to remember it wasn't always a settler colony. As I've mentioned before, colonial interests in Canada began as a resource extraction colony. The fur trade did not focus on building permanent settlements across the continent. Instead, there were fur trade forts and traders that participated in a cross-continental economy. The English and the French were both represented by their traders, and strategic trade and military alliances were built with many different indigenous nations by both countries. The English and the French competed with each other for territorial and economic alliances. In the 1700s, Europeans were very dependent upon the support and alliance with indigenous nations. Following the French retreat from North America in the 1760s, however, English colonial policy changed abruptly, immediately, overnight. Once England was no longer competing with France for North American trade routes, nor was England needing military support to fend off French forces. English colonial policy immediately shifted towards more settler ambitions. This intensified the racism and the violence directed at Indigenous people. Regular payments to Indigenous allies that had been made for generations immediately ceased following the end of armed conflict with the French. Treaties began to be broken, both by English colonial officials as well as the people who later called themselves American following the American Revolution. Both the French and the Americans outnumbered the English in North America. England began to shift more towards a settler colonial model in Canada so they could control the economy. The settler colonial model is built to exclude Indigenous political power and insist that English culture be imposed upon everybody. It was in this context that anti-French bias began to grow in Canada. Racism is always reinventing itself, and racist stereotypes always exist to promote the interests of the elite. In the late 1700s, there were many French speakers in Canada, but no longer the political presence or support from France. English colonial officials immediately began outlawing the practice of Catholicism, immediately began insisting that business be conducted in English, and reorganized the economy to benefit English and Protestant businesses. French Canadians were depicted in racist cartoons as backward peasants or untrustworthy papists. For the next 200 years, building a British nation became the goal of colonial officials. Key moments in Canada's nation building consistently reinforced the theme that the French language and the Catholic faith were impediments to Canada's future development and prosperity. Take, for example, the Durham Report in 1839. It recommended that Upper and Lower Canada, Ontario and Quebec in today's terms, be unified in what was a precursor to Confederation. Lord Durham argued that the French should assimilate English customs because they are, quote, a people with no literature and no history. In 1869, Louis Riel formed a provisional government in what is now Manitoba in order to resist what he and his Métis nation feared, that they would be outnumbered by Protestant white English settlers. The Manitoba Act, established the year later, protected the right to both French language and Catholic education. The Northwest Resistance, 15 years later in what is now Saskatchewan, was a similarly anti-colonial conflict led by Métis and First Nations resistors. Following the hanging of Louis Riel, British colonial authority was secured across the plains, resulting in the imposition of further English Protestant rule. Settler colonialism is a system of power designed to control land. Immigration was a tool used strategically by British colonial officials to outnumber French-speaking communities as well as Indigenous communities in North America. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, immigration was strongly encouraged from Europe in particular. Tens of thousands of immigrants arrived by boat each month into Canadian ports. In the history of racism, the turn of the 20th century is a key moment. This is when the notion of whiteness began to shift and expand. In 1911, C.E. Simmons, an MP from Lethbridge, Alberta, told a newspaper that he did not think Alberta would stand for a, quote, invasion of colored people. Similarly, British Columbia's premier in 1916, the same year a ship, the Komagata Maru, was docked in British Columbia ports for over 2 months and eventually turned back to India, where many of its occupants died. In 1916, the British Columbian premier said, "We always have in mind the necessity of keeping this a white man's country." Non-white immigrants were either banned, required to pay additional taxes to immigrate, or disallowed from immigrating with their families. Non-Anglo-European immigrants were allowed to arrive in family groupings, but they also experienced harsh racism. These signs from the turn of the 20th century emphasize the white-on-white discrimination that was taking place. Today, it seems unheard of that an Irish person would not be considered white. But 100 years ago, Irish immigrants, Catholics, French speakers, Greeks, these groups often faced dehumanizing rates of overt racism. They were considered ethnically distinct and inferior to the Anglo elite. As I mentioned, it was in this time period that racism began to change. Whereas in prior eras of racist history, non-white populations were forced into indenture, or killed, or exiled, at the turn of the 20th century there was a progressive movement among the Anglo majority. Progressive racists argued that uncivilized races could be civilized through education and training. This was still racism, to be clear. It was simply slightly more humane than its predecessors. Progressive racism did not advocate for everyone to be included in society. Rather, progressive racism suggested that marginalized populations could be included if they upheld the moral and social and political authority of the ruling elite. This is part of the logic that informed the creation of the residential school system. It also informed efforts to improve European immigrant life in Canada's inner cities. The turn of the 20th century was a crisis for urban life. There were no building bylaws preventing the creation of slum housing. There were no laws mandating school for children. There was unsafe drinking water, repeated outbreaks of infectious diseases, and the only hospitals were run by religious charities. A broad coalition of social workers, activists, artists, labor leaders, industry leaders, and politicians formed a social and urban reform movement to create more schools, hospitals, public parks, urban sanitation facilities, and so on. Included in these initiatives were programs where upper-class Anglo women educated immigrant women on how to dress, how to cook, how to speak, how to act. where to worship, and how to decorate their homes so that they too could become so-called proper Canadian citizens. Just to be clear, this was a campaign of assimilation. Over time, many non-Anglo-European immigrants anglicized their names, joined Protestant churches, worked to mask their accents or cook blander food. 3 generations later, many grandchildren of these so-called ethnic immigrants now identify and pass as white. Today, we see white anglo-saxon Protestant dominance reflected in the taken for granted norms of Canadian society. Consider who gets to call themselves Canadian without any added qualifier? Who gets to pass as somebody who belongs without being asked where they're really from? Whose holidays continue to be observed as statutory? Who just fits in as normal? As I've mentioned before, racism is always reinventing itself. Whiteness was not invented in the 20th century, but it certainly took on new meanings over the course of the 20th century. By adopting English names and accents, by changing or denying one's cultural practices, many non-Anglo immigrants were able to pass. By pass, I mean they could look authentically Canadian by settler colonial standards. They could escape some of the violence endured by their grandparents. Central to this passing was their white skin. And so today, 100 years later, we think of race as skin color or hair texture or eye shape. We think in largely physical terms. But 100 years ago, race would have included religion, accent, trade, and so on. Over the course of the 20th century, some people became white, and others did not. A helpful way to think about whiteness is to use Jean Bobby Noble's concept of it being a class-based race. Noble is a university professor in Toronto. He has described his working-class upbringing as off-white, but now, as an upper-middle-class urban professional, he is fully white. Thinking about whiteness as a class-based race helps us identify what gets accepted as unmarked and white, and what stands out. Behavior associated with working-class culture often gets caricatured as so-called white trash. Consider this. Are the white folks who live in trailer parks as white as the white folks who live in suburban cul-de-sacs? When we talk about whiteness, it's easy to think we're talking about white bodies. But actually, scholars have studied the ways that whiteness is enacted through behavior, not just skin. Behavior that is coded as proper, as cultivated, as belonging to morally virtuous citizens, that is often what is considered white. It's also behind the accusation people of color face when they are told they are speaking white or acting white. Often, they are being told they are speaking in an educated way. This reinforces the association of whiteness with cultivated, polite behavior and upper-class norms. Consider this. Racist stereotypes commonly characterize non-white people as too much of something. Physical largesse has been associated with blackness for the better part of 300 years. This image of Aunt Jemima is an example of a long tradition emphasizing the physicality of black womanhood. Colin Kaepernick's very peaceful, relatively small protest was described as aggressive and unprofessional, leading to his firing from the NFL. Non-Anglo food is routinely described as too spicy, rather than English food being rightfully described as fairly bland. Similarly, any alternative to the dominant heterosexual paradigm is associated with taking up too much space, being loud, despite the fact that heterosexual lifestyles are projected in every media platform without pause. Adopting an anti-racist perspective is a rewiring of the brain away from the messages of the dominant culture. Racism is resilient, and it is savvy. One way of trying to look beneath the surface to see racism when it appears to be nowhere in sight is to look for the ways that whiteness ends up looking not like an identity, but just normal. Another way of defining whiteness beyond the paradigm of skin is to think of whiteness benefiting from any attempt to conform or to assimilate into the dominant culture. I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about whiteness. Whiteness to white people is the same as masculinity to men. It's an ideal. It's a category we aren't encouraged to talk about. And for those who pass as white, it's an identity we need to disrupt. Whiteness is present in the dress code norms in any given workplace. It's present in the rites of passage we are encouraged to expect to go through, and the social groupings we are expected to want to belong to. It's reflected in whose holiday is considered normal, and especially in whose holiday dominates the shopping mall decor every year. I'd like to speak for a moment about white folks themselves. Whiteness is an ideal. Ideals are always out of reach. No one can ever be rich enough, or pretty enough, or popular enough. You can also never be white enough. So, if, like me, you're watching this and you're white, I'd like to invite you to think about any of the parts of your identity you work to hide or assimilate. It could be the shame you feel about your grandparents' accent, or the size of your house, or the commitment to never having a chipped nail in public, or the endless cycle of dieting so many of us have been trapped in. I'd like to invite you to think about how these practices at keeping up with the Joneses is actually a form of labor geared towards looking or acting as white as possible.
This way of talking about whiteness as a thing that people strive to be is a way of talking that comes out of an anti-racist tradition that includes James Baldwin, W.B. Du Bois, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. These intellectuals argue that the real anti-racism movement can be achieved when white people stop trying to act white and start engaging in anti-racism. Perhaps one of the reasons that it's so hard to ask for a change in white behavior, to be far more collectively in support of anti-racist and oppressive actions, is that the behavioral and cultural norms that make up much of what is known as the Western world is determined by WASP cultural norms. They are so ubiquitous that we are all asked to adopt and co-sign them, regardless of our racial identity. In essence, we have to be cognizant of the behaviors to know to change them. Take any of the 10 ideas presented on this slide. All of these and many more would be a version of what is deemed to be culturally normal, culturally permissible, and culturally acceptable according to white anglo-saxon Protestant norms. When talking about widely represented family types or emotions and how they are sanctioned, or how we think about how we position ourselves and others into the categories of deserving and undeserving of their outcomes, all of these things are rooted in the constructs of white anglo-saxon Protestant ideals. For you, as teachers of French as a second language, it might be important or interesting to recognize that though a language other than English is being taught in your classrooms, the culture in which it's being taught is still determined by these cultural norms. Consider how we understand behavior and how the idea of quietness in classrooms is expected and sanctioned. These and other examples demonstrate what we mean here by WASP cultural norms. Taking a moment to go further into this, I wanted to consider how intersecting identities also interact with WASP cultural norms. If we were to think about how gender interacts, we might notice how we set expectations and show appreciation of output of work. There might be a gender skew that is apparent in whose work we expect to have a certain level of substance to it and whose work we accept regardless of presentational style or level of completeness. We might also think about the idea of passive or non-direct communication, or about how some of the allowances that are made for moments of male aggression in frustration, when things don't go the way how they expected, might not be the same as the expectation of young women and girls to be more muted and confined in their expression, even when they are struggling with things for a prolonged period of time. Similarly, when we think about class or socioeconomic cultural norms, there is a level of expected assumed sameness in both experience and belief. We are required to out ourselves when these are different. It can be an ask that has repercussions that cause many to choose not to do so. For example, think about those of our students who may present as white but might be Jewish, those of our students who may attend an independent school but might be on financial assistance, or those of our students who may be from more wealthy backgrounds and attend public school. We can understand that some things are shared in these moments and some things are not shared because the cultural norm determines what is allowed and what is appropriate and what is accepted in being shared in those moments and what is seen as being too much for others to be shared with. I want us to take a moment here to consider the differences between that which is systemic within white supremacy and that which is cultural. Though they are related, they're not the same. There's obviously a relationship between the two insofar as one codifies the other, as understood by the systemic aspect of white supremacy, legalizing institutions and creating policies and procedures that cement and create ideas of white supremacy are related to the cultural aspect of white supremacy, which props up these ideations. They become the ubiquitous, in the water, just cultural ways that we behave that support further creation of white supremacist ideals in a systemic way. Here's a good moment to pause and reflect. With what has been said so far, consider how WASP cultural norms show up both overtly and tacitly within your schools. Which rules and conventions uphold these? Do you notice a difference in how French students and studies are constructed? Are there explicit rules and cultures that you have to teach that you'd not even give a second thought to in terms of being English or Canadian in culture? What is seen to be the pinnacle of or existing within the canon of French language learning? Have you noticed the same things coming up across your career, or perhaps in different cohorts and students, or perhaps you've noticed different contextual differences?
We want to be thinking about where do these things also show up above the ground. In essence, what are the shoots, what are the stems, and what are the tips? Well, a great place to look in this situation would be in the collection of stories that have become histories that a nation ends up telling itself and educating itself on. In every case, this leads to a greater understanding of cultural domination and cloning. If a nation is built on the power held in these stories, it doesn't matter whether the approach is taken by a democracy or a dictatorship. Both are in service of the same understanding that how a country educates its people is a key ingredient to creating a sense of unified identity. This case is no different when Canada comes to mind. It is a country that exists within a historically constructed environment that has reinforced subsequent culture in its own image. I want to take a moment to notice how questioning the purpose of education can lead to uncovering some of the ways that some have been excluded, segregated, and limited in what they've been taught, how they've been taught it, and why these groups and their experiences have been important to be included or left out. For the next part of our learning, I want to take a look at the experiences for three distinct groups who have experienced education in Canada very differently as a result of systemic white supremacy and its project of cultural cloning. These group experiences are those of Canada's Black population, Indigenous peoples, and white women. They give some indication as to the different intentions behind how they were educated, why they were educated, and what they were educated in. Similar to its neighbour, the United States, Canada's educational policy with regards to its Black population can also be characterised by that of segregation. As we can see from the earliest dates, 1911, some universities outright banned or made hard the admission of Black students to some of the perceived most prestigious courses and institutions. A side note to consider is the struggle of some of our students to this day in accessing or feeling comfortable within those places. Whether it was the policy of banning Black students to medical school, or rescinding an application of acceptance to a Black student, or denying admission to nursing schools on the grounds that bias that patients would have would be a problem, we can see that throughout this period there were a number of Black students who clearly had the aptitude and willingness to excel within certain educational institutions who found blockages and barriers to accessing the education that they rightly deserved. There is a line to be drawn with the same idea within languages, where in some cases Black students of Anglophone backgrounds are underestimated in their ability to pick up French as a second language, whilst at the same time, students who speak French as their first language are often placed into lower classes for English instruction by the same virtue. So again, as a French as a second language teacher, it is important to be thinking about where some of these notions of barriers and challenges appear, both in what you're doing in the classroom and how the classroom has been set up, and how they have a historic root in white supremacy. In addition to the segregationist experience of anti-Black racism in education, anti-Indigenous educational policy was more directly lethal to that population. Characterized by the residential school program, which operated from the 1870s all the way through to very recently in the 1990s, it had two goals. One being assimilation by a method of eradication and genocide of anything that was not useful to imperialist, colonialist, WASP cultural norms, and the other being to cover up that there was ever anything of value and of humanity in existence beforehand. Being forbidden to speak home languages, being required to speak English or French, depending on location, and being required to adopt the religious denomination of the school demonstrates psychological torture, while the efforts with which it was required to obtain this total adherence are shown in physical violence. It's an approach that exemplifies the idea of systemic white supremacy versus white supremacy culture. What we can see through both the Black and Indigenous experiences demonstrative of how white supremacy in education shows up through exclusion and suppression, as well as eradication and overwriting of those who it deems not worthy of the education that it has set up for itself. If we were to look back at Canadian attitudes towards social and educational values, how do we view the statements of uniformity of experience and cultural pluralism through the experiences of these two groups, and their legacy and their relationship to structural Canadian education? Again, take this moment to consider the population of which you serve as a French as a second language teacher. Consider which students are interpersonally, institutionally, or structurally presented with barriers to succeed in your subject areas, and which students are perhaps less likely to show up on your radar as needing extra help or extra support. How much of French history towards Indigenous people is taught alongside the grammar and syntax of the language? How much of this is even uncomfortable to sit with? We've looked at how gender shows up in WASP cultural norms, and therefore its agency within white supremacy. And when looking at education, it is a place where we might substitute white for wealthy when defining the W within WASP cultural norms. In this way, it serves as an interesting analysis for interrogating the idea of equality of access and apply a lens of gender and wealth to this. In 1871, the establishment of 3 potential public schools showed that the number of girls enrolled in Ontario schools approximated that to the number of boys. This gives an indication of the interest that there was in girls wanting to be educated at the same time. Soon after, in 1872, the British Columbia Superintendent of Education declared that a woman's mission was to be predominantly that of an educator, specifically of infants and young children. And looking at the timing of this and what was proclaimed within it, we can already start to see what white supremacist patriarchy had in mind for women and their education. That of limited options and only those which served the system already constructed in its image. Add to this that being educated at a more advanced level was only available to those at private colleges. It starts to give some insight into the more tangible barriers that would have impacted families overall. It's really crucial to understand that if not all European people at this time were considered white, not all of those who had a chance at passing as it would have had an opportunity to have made wealth and been considered wealthy. So education would have privileged very few while leaving many behind. Now add to that the rigidity of gender constructs within WASP culture, you start to get a question in mind about how much value there might have been in educated women at that time. So why make this point? Well, there are many layers to it. One is to understand that entrenched underestimation of women and what they can achieve has been a long-standing trunk of what the roots of white supremacy has pushed above the surface. If this had been true for white women who share the same racial identity as those in power, but not the same gender identity, it should also give some thought in understanding how oppression and intersectionality operate. Another reason is to understand how the system of patriarchy within white supremacy has also simultaneously laid the seeds of, particularly for white women, to continue the oppression of others. Through an intentional divorce of understanding that their liberation is tied up in the liberation of others, inaction and lateral violence towards others can be a common implicit bias towards those deemed different in their race, culture, and expressed into gender to those of WASP norms. We've looked at a lot in this section and in this module overall. In concluding your understanding of how white supremacy has left its legacy within education, have a think about how you and your subject shows up as an interruption or continuation of what has been intentionally laid out for you. As expressed before about white supremacy, anything seen as being closer to itself has been intentionally seen as unremarkable. Intentional as it keeps you from questioning why there is any anxiety for those further away, and why you might have anxiety in your exploration of this. As you wrap up this module and prepare for the next, stay curious and stay committed to weeding out these roots. Thanks.
Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey. Should you have any questions or comments about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a non-profit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. In addition, a special thanks goes to the educators who contributed their expertise and their experience to the creation and development of these modules.